welcome back to the Pacific War Channel, the channel where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War, 1937 to 1945, and all the major events that led up to it. Today, we're going to be speaking about one of the most important events in modern Chinese history, the May 4th movement of 1919. And please, do not forget to like and subscribe, as it feeds these two demon birds who need their seeds. Isn't that right, Charlotte? As we had seen in my previous episode on the Xinhai Revolution and on the series on World War I in Asia, China underwent one of its most tumultuous periods in its entire history. This created the Xinwenhuai Yudong, New Cultural Movement in 1915, and the Wusuyu Yundong, May 4th Movement of 1919, changing China forever. China had been undergoing what is called the Century of Humiliation. Ever since the Opium Wars and countless other slights, the people of China were dissatisfied, to say the least.
A report this week, which was referenced, does indicate that your company has a bank account in China.
I mean, I was a businessman doing business.
The Qing dynasty was overthrown during the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, ushering in the new Republic of China. But good old Yuan Shikai quickly wrestled control of the movement created by Dr. Sun Yat-sen and seized the presidency of the new republic and eventually elected himself emperor over the new Hongxian dynasty. To make matters even worse, during all of this, World War I kicked off, and with it, another dose of humiliation from external actors. Japan joined World War I and laid siege to the German concession in Shandong province, Tsingtao. After defeating the Germans, the Japanese began occupying the province, much to the disdain of the Chinese people. Then, to make matters worse, Japan presented China with the infamous 21 demands. Yuan Shikai had spent his time in power propping up military governors all over China, and he found himself unable to sign the 21 demands as he was competing with these very warlords for control over China. He could not afford a war with Japan at the same time. Then, the guy dies in 1916, leading China to fall into what is known as the Warlord Era. Thanks, Yuan Shikai. His predecessor, Premier Dan Ziye, faced quite a conundrum. The Chinese people wanted the Japanese to leave.
Do me a favor, please. Get out of here. Get out of here, man. Shit, I'm saying.
And the Japanese were trying to score a deal with the Entente powers to keep the territory after World War I had concluded. America, looking to mess with the Japanese, advised China to enter World War I on the side of the Entente powers to try and get a chance at the peace table, and perhaps wrestle back the occupied territory and end the humiliating extraterritoriality that most of the great powers still held over it. The Chinese government took this advice, but wanted to hedge their bets. So in 1918, a secret agreement called the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement was formed.
Which was one of the worst things that ever happened. It is the worst deal maybe ever signed anywhere.
Basically, Japan wanted China to allow it to move military forces in China to thwart a possible German or Bolshevik-led offensive along the Manchurian borders. Japan threatened to stop providing financial aid to China, forcing them to play ball. Unfortunately, the Chinese news press caught wind of all of this and leaked it to the public, who were outraged. During World War I, China sent hundreds of thousands of laborers to help France, Britain, and Russia, and they were given 2 seats at the Paris Peace Conference. Things were looking good, and the Chinese delegation presented their demands. They proposed the internationalization of the Manchurian railways and rivers, the elimination of legation guards, getting rid of foreign troops stationed in China, the abolition of extraterritorial rights, recognition of China's sovereignty over tariffs and railways, and above all else, the return of Shandong province. The great powers said, "No."
You serious?
No, and ignored the delegation for the rest of the conference. Yes, it turns out the Entente powers had promised Japan Shandong province in return for their help during the war. The Chinese public was livid upon hearing the news of what had just occurred. Now going back a bit to 1915, ever since the Japanese began encroaching in Shandong province, young Chinese intellectuals began demanding reforms. A lot of them were inspired by a monthly magazine called Xingxingnian, the New Youth, written by the Dean of Peking University, Chen Zhuxiu, who advocated for a vast intellectual, literary, and cultural revolution to rejuvenate China. This all became known as the Xinwanhai Yudong New Cultural Movement. The movement attacked traditional Confucian ideas on the basis they reinforced outdated social values like hierarchy, paternalism, obedience, and unquestioning respect. Instead, the movement promoted Western ideas such as democracy, science, republicanism, self-determination, equality, and individual liberties. They argued China could not be democratic while political authority was reinforced by Confucian teachings, which blocked progress. They also argued that Confucian patriarchal family structures impeded individual freedoms and the rights of women. They proposed a new naturalistic vernacular writing style, Bai Hua replacing the difficult 2,000-year-old classical style of Wei Yan. In a nutshell, they wanted more democratic and egalitarian values, and above all else, they wanted to orient the nation towards the future rather than the past. The movement coincided with the public outrage that had been brewing over the years, and the treatment of China during the Treaty of Versailles was the straw that broke the camel's back. At 1:30 p.m. on Sunday of May the 4th of 1919, more than 3,000 students from 13 different colleges in Beijing held a mass demonstration against the decision of the Paris Peace Conference at Tiananmen Square. They demanded the Chinese legation not sign the treaty and drafted 5 resolutions to oppose the granting of Shandong province to the Japanese under former German concessions, to draw and increase awareness of China's precarious position to the masses in China, to recommend a large-scale gathering in Beijing, to promote the creation of a Beijing student union, and to hold a demonstration that afternoon in protest to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Chinese government chose to acquiesce to the decision of the Paris Peace Conference, further infuriating the students who marched from Tiananmen Square to the legation corridor. They shouted slogans such as, "Struggle for the sovereignty externally, get rid of the national traitors at home. Do away with the 21 demands. Don't sign the treaty." The protesters called for a boycott of Japanese products and demanded the resignation of 3 Chinese officials accused of collaborating with the Japanese. Things got violent as they began to burn down the residences of those officials, such as the house of the Minister of Communications. They also assaulted China's Minister to Japan. The police attacked the protesters and arrested 32 students. Word spread across China, and over the following weeks, the demonstrations spread across the country. Several students were killed and wounded. More than 1,000 would be arrested. In large cities around China, strikes and boycotts against Japanese products would last over 2 months.
Shut the fuck up! Know your fucking place, trash!
Then on June the 5th, the working class began to join the demonstrations, particularly in Shanghai, where 100,000 industrial workers performed a week-long general strike, angry at how the government had suppressed the students in Beijing. To add to the grievances of the students, the workers added their own demands: higher wages, better conditions, and an end to the exploitation. What had started as a student demonstration had expanded into a national movement involving students, organized labor, and political groups. This pressured the government to dismiss the 3 pro-Japanese officials, sack several key ministers, collapsing the cabinet, and instruct the delegation in Europe not to sign the Treaty of Versailles. As part of the movement, hundreds of publications began to spread the new thought, and this led to the decline of traditional ethics and the family system. Emancipation for women gathered steam, a vernacular literature emerged, and political developments also began to spread. The May 4th movement achieved many of its objectives, though Shandong province would only be handed back over to China later on in 1922. Before the movement, many Chinese reformists placed their faith in Western models of government, and the promises of Western leaders that China would gain independence and self-determination. But these promises and that faith were broken at Paris. The Treaty of Versailles demonstrated to China that they could not wait for Western nations to guide them into modernity. China would be responsible for its own fate, and thus a divergence began. What would occur was the birth of communism in China and the resurrection of the Kuomintang nationalists. You see, when China sent laborers to Russia during the Great War, many of them became enthralled in the Bolshevik-led revolution. Many of those Chinese who came back home brought with them the Bolshevik ideology. Chen Jixiu became the dean of Peking University in 1917, and a Marxist study group led by Li Dajiao attracted his attention in 1919. Chen Jixiu would go on during the May 4th movement to publish a special edition of the New Youth on Marxism, with Li Dajiao as his general editor, providing the most detailed analysis of Marxism at that point published in China. Amongst many, Mao Zedong would become influenced by all of this. Chen Jixiu and Li Dajiao would found the CCP in the French concession of Shanghai in 1921, and Mao Zedong likewise formed his own branch in Changsha. The May 4th movement likewise resurrected the exiled Kuomintang on October the 10th of 1919, led again by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. In 1920, the Kuomintang set up a government in Guangzhou, but failed to achieve full control over all of China. They held a strong opposition to certain aspects of the May 4th revolution, because from their perspective, the movement destroyed some positive elements of Chinese tradition and placed too heavy an emphasis on direct political actions and radicalism. And so the board was set for China during the 1920s. The country was fractured into warlord states, and now differing groups would fight for control over the nation to direct its future. Hold on to your butts, because the Warlord Era is here, and soon I will be creating a multi-part series on the wars to unify China. Alright, so let's just summarize everything we have now just learnt. China had been humiliated and abused during World War I by the great powers and the Empire of Japan. Students began the May 4th movement to protest their government's weak response to the Treaty of Versailles and usher in some reforms. The movement grew to include the working class, ushering in the birth of the CCP and the resurrection of the KMT. Now China would be fought over by the warlords. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and please do not forget to hit that like and subscribe button, as it means a lot to this small channel. And as you can see, it feeds much needed seeds to these two demon birds. Isn't that right, Charlotte? This has been the Pacific War Channel, over and out.